reading Schopenhauer on pessimism might actually be good for you. As a matter of fact, not only good for you, but it might be enjoyable. And not just in a schadenfreude sort of way, where we, enjoy the fact that somebody is worse off than we are. But I think that's the entry point for us, to understand why it's good for us. One of the reasons that Schopenhauer is good for us to read is because he's worse off than we are. Now, I said that it wasn't schadenfreude. Here's what I mean. Reading someone like that, reading someone who is at the extremes, validates us not being 100% optimistic, not being utopian. If we only ever encounter people saying, oh, look on the bright side of life, things are good, look out there, things are great, you have it good, just focus on the things that are good in your life. If that's all that you ever hear, then you might be sitting alone at night and say, well, people say that it's good, but I'm miserable. Well, if it really is good, then maybe I'm the problem. That's dangerous. It's healthy for us in those sorts of situations to encounter someone who actually says, no, you know what? This is awful, and there is more pain than pleasure in the world, and the whole world is like a sideshow, a carnival show that's not meant to be seen more than once. It's useful for us to get a dose of that kind of thing. And we see this, by the way, in comedy. That's one of the ways in which comedy actually functions. Comedy oftentimes is funny because it's true, and it's felt to be true in a certain way that we're not comfortable with saying out loud. And so the comedians get that kind of knee-jerk laughing response from us because we are uncomfortable in a certain way. But it's also a cathartic, yes, haha, that's what I was thinking. That's the way I feel too, but I was afraid to say it. The same kind of thing can happen with Schopenhauer. It's useful for us to encounter someone like him who is on one of the extremes because it helps to validate some of what it is that we are probably already thinking in some regard. And more than that, it's useful that Schopenhauer is worse off than we are. Why is that the case? Because we can look at that extreme, toy with the extreme, flirt with the extreme, just like people do in politics, just like people do in a variety of other situations. We flirt with the extreme, and part of what that does for us is that it helps us to realize that we don't really want to go as far in that extreme as we thought we did. If all you're ever hearing is optimism, and you don't feel perfectly optimistic about life, and you feel painfully that the world is not necessarily as good as everyone says that it is, then the motion is like everyone pulling you back in the direction of optimism. And so naturally, if that's not how you feel, then you're pulling in the other direction. And you may think that you have to pull really hard, especially if they're pulling you hard, and the cultural values say, no, the world is good. You should think that everything is good. Then you may be pulling really hard in the direction of pessimism. And you might think that you're just going to go all the way and just say that everything in life is bad. But when you encounter someone like Schopenhauer who really does say that everything is awful and, the balance of pain to pleasure is just terrible. In fact, if we want to understand the balance of pain to pleasure in the world, then we should look at a situation where one animal is eating and the other one is being eaten. It's obvious in that situation that one is experiencing a little bit of pleasure, but nothing compared to the pain of being destroyed. And so that's the kind of thing that if we are constantly pulled towards optimism and we feel consumed by the world, being eaten, then that portion of us is going to want to pull really hard in the direction of pessimism. So it's useful to see someone like Schopenhauer and to react to that and say, you know what? Never mind. It's not actually that bad. There are some things in life that I enjoy. And hopefully it's more than just music and the like in terms of being able to escape from the will. This is Schopenhauer's prescription, is being able to escape an aesthetic enjoyment, especially an aesthetic enjoyment that gives us a will-less state, something where we have a reprieve from the pain of willing, the pain of desiring. And this is the other element that I think is particularly therapeutic, particularly useful for us in the modern world. And it's useful in exactly the same way, and this isn't a coincidence, in exactly the same way that Buddhism is. in the sense that desire is not necessarily pure. I don't just want something and then it's great when I get it. The act of desiring itself is painful. Desire is a lack. This is the way that the Greeks talked about it as well. We experience desire as a lack because we want something that we don't have. Now, when we put it in that way, if you look at the terms themselves, then what you realize is that you also, and Schopenhauer points this out again in his essays on pessimism, when you obtain the object of your desire, you can't want it anymore. You can't want something that you already have. And so that mechanic where the attenuation of desire happens upon the attainment of its object, that in itself might give us some solace. That might give us some reason for saying, you know what, I've always been frustrated that I don't have a lot of money or that I can't go out and do the things that I want to do, but it might actually help us to realize that, you know, if I stop for a second and I think, what would it be like to actually have the object of my desire? At first, it might be nice, but we very quickly, as Schopenhauer so acutely points out, we very quickly become bored. And we very quickly become sated and unable to desire what it is that we already have, and so we move on to other things. That's the way that we are naturally constituted. So it might help us to realize that it isn't just, you know, the grass is greener and these green pastures are available. If only I could obtain the object of my desire. It doesn't really work that way. And so that's part of the lesson that we get from Schopenhauer, and not coincidentally, like I said, Schopenhauer studied Buddhism and studied the East, and in particular the Upanishads. And so the idea in Buddhism, for instance, the first noble truth that all life is dukkha, and this is often translated as suffering, but I like to use the sort of made-up word for a good reason because I don't think we necessarily should translate it. I like to use the word dissatisfactoriness. And so it is the dissatisfactoriness of life that is inherent in all the things that we desire. In other words, there is something about each individual desire that we have that isn't complete. It's not whole and fulfilling in itself. There's always some discoloration. There's always some taint and imperfection in it. In other words, there is always some element of suffering in the desires and in being human in the world. And so this is one of the things that is fundamental to Buddhism. It's also one of the reasons why it is that people will say, along with Schopenhauer, that Buddhism is pessimistic. It's not, but that's an easy way for us to look at that and say, oh, well, if you're, saying bad things about the world and that suffering is, well, if you're focusing on the suffering, you must be a pessimist. And this is part of the heritage that we have in terms of, wanting to be optimistic. And so I think Schopenhauer provides us with a nice balance in that way, which is why I think that reading Schopenhauer can actually be good for us.